night. Great pleasure to introduce Antony Beevor, Sir Antony Beevor, who was educated at Winchester College, partly by my father, I discovered earlier. Well, he was a master and you were a boy, so it was he knew who he was, that's something. And then went on with a fairly short career in the army with the 11th Hussars.
5 years altogether.
5 years, commissioned officer, did your bit. And then drifted into writing, more or less.
More or less.
Yes. So, I mean, how did you arrive as a military historian? How did that happen?
Well, becoming a writer was rather a strange thing in a way. Fortunately, with the sort of innocence and arrogance of youth, I thought, why not? After 5 years in the army, in fact, I wrote my first novel, which thank God was never published. And I thought, well, I do want to try and be a writer. But I mean, in those days, there wasn't any, there weren't the sort of, the University of East Anglia writing courses or anything like that. And the only way actually to learn was to be published yourself, which may seem a little bit of paradox. And I was very lucky because at Jonathan Cape, I had a brilliant editor who I would come out after 2 hours feeling totally humiliated, but I learned more from her than I would have done in any other circumstances. But otherwise, I was published by John Murray, and which was rather nice because actually I was the 6th generation of the family published by John Murray going back to the 1830s. So, I think there's no DNA in writing, let's face it, it either gives you enough confidence to be able to do it, or, you just get on with it when you can. But after doing a couple of novels, basically they were sort of political thrillers to sort of get my hand in a way, then publishers said, listen, this is crazy, you've got the military experience and so forth. And that's when I started on the Spanish Civil War and then a whole lot of others, and it sort of all went off in that particular direction. So should we say a writing career is never exactly planned in advance?
No. And as you probably all know, but if you don't, I'm going to say it, Antony went on to become a huge bestseller with books mostly about the Second World War,
yeah.
Stalingrad, the fall of Berlin, World War II, and numerous others. And certainly in the UK and around the world is pretty much a household name when it comes to understanding what happened during the Second World War. So I'm very interested into why, with your latest book, you moved back in time to the end of the First World War and the whole story of the Russian Revolution.
Well, originally I was going to try and do this particular subject of covering the Russian Revolution, the Finnish Civil War, the Hungarian Revolution, and all the rest of it, back in the later 1980s. But again, thank goodness, the publisher at the time, Chatto and Windus, said, no, we've got another idea for you, which actually was lucky. A, as a historian, I just wasn't ready to tackle something as enormous as that. But B, the Russian archives weren't open at that stage. And it was only after sort of the Pikoya, the Minister of the Archives under Yeltsin, forced the military to start opening their archives, that one had a chance. I did have the first opportunity of working in the Russian archives in 1992 when Arthur and I did a book on Paris after the liberation, because all of the material was in Moscow. So those were interesting days. It was a little bit like playing scissors, paper, stone, because quite often they were trying to block you in different ways, and then you had to find a way around. And quite often you'd be able to find in another archive, copies which had been sent by whichever department it was. And that actually was, jumping forward to Ukraine, was frankly one of my chief worries. As soon as you saw that the Russian tanks were heading for Kiev in those early days, you thought, my God, if they take the Ukrainian archives, which everybody from Tim Snyder through to who've worked on that particular period have used, it would be an absolute disaster.
Along the way, you have a significant ban in Russia. If you were to go to Russia, you might find yourself incarcerated. Can you put the microphone just a little bit further away?
Oh, sorry, it's too far.
The reason is because on the Zoom it distorts.
Right. Okay.
You can't hear me because I'm too far away. All right. Well, okay. We'll just have to find the sweet spot somewhere in the middle.
Right.
Sorry.
Well, I hope this is roughly around the right sort of distance.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds fair. Yeah, yeah.
Good.
So,
Sorry, where?
why you can't go to Russia?
Oh, I see. Yes. Well, what happened
Particular
was,
sentence for years rather than
well, in 5 years imprisonment, according to Sergei Shoigu, who brought this law in through the Duma, saying anybody who insulted the Red Army in the Second World War was held for 5 years. And I actually, funnily enough, was in Tallinn in Estonia at the Estonian Literary Festival, also with Catherine Meredale, who did a superb book on Ivan's War. And we both realized, we were in the firing line, and I'd been condemned ever since the book came out, the Berlin book came out, as the chief slanderer of the Red Army, because actually of the mass rapes and all of the documents came from their own archives. That's why they were so angry.
Indeed, and they presumably wouldn't be particularly happy about the way you portray the revolution.
Well, funny enough, they're much more sensitive about the Second World War than they are about the Civil War. But I'm sure we'll be getting onto that anyway, and about the way that Putin sort of played things in that sense. Yes.
On this theme, I want to just quote a little bit from the conclusion of the book, which I thought was an interesting way into thinking about what your approach to the history and how the Russian Revolution plays forward towards the Second World War. You say, for far too long, we have made the mistake of talking about wars as a single entity, when they are often a conglomeration of different conflicts, mixing national resentments, ethnic hatreds, and class warfare.
Yes.
Can you speak to that?
Well, I think that is certainly true, and one finds that particularly in civil wars. I'd already worked on the Spanish Civil War, and I was struck both by similarities and, of course, by contrasts. In the Spanish Civil War, yes, there was a lot of killing, but that was, on the whole, the killing of really basically people shooting the other side so as to avoid revenge. When it came to the Russian Civil War, what was terrifying was the sheer degree of sadism even and the cruelty, which was totally unnecessary. It wasn't a question of extracting information or anything like that. And this goes back, I think, very much to Pushkin's great phrase about sort of, Russian revolt, senseless and merciless. And there was a very, very large element of that. And one's only got to look back to Russian history, all the way to the Mongol invasions and whatever one may argue with the origins of the cruelty in their methods of war, which run right up till today. But again, another important area of discussion. One is hugely conscious of the way of why in Russia there was tremendous sort of suffering which was absorbed, and then there would be an explosion. And certainly in 1917 was the start really of this explosion of violence and cruelty.
And as you read the book, at the beginning, the Bolshevik project seems to be fairly improbable. The chances of it succeeding would by contemporaries weren't taken that seriously, and looking at it from this perspective, it seems improbable. Do you feel that there was a particular decisive moments when the course of history was determined, rather than going the other way, which is a successful counter-revolution, or a more moderate form of resolution to the conflict?
I don't think there was a moderate resolution in a way. The trouble was that the Russian officer class was so demoralized by the disintegration of the Russian army, the Tsarist army, during that particular period of the end of 1916, beginning of 1917. And that sort of bitterness and anger meant that actually nobody really lifted a finger in the real revolution of February 1917, which was a genuine street revolution. And the Bolsheviks had nothing to do with it. I mean, Lenin was in Switzerland, Trotsky was in North America, Stalin was in Siberia. And they just thought, and in fact, the other members of the Central Committee thought that it was just going to be a bread riot and, give out more bread and the whole thing would disappear. But it wasn't that at all. So when it came to this period of the provisional government, this interregnum between the two so-called revolutions, the provisional government didn't stand a chance because the backbone of the Tsarist state had been destroyed. They may have had ministers and ministries and so forth, but actually they had no control over events. And they were trying to build this sort of democracy of with a constituent assembly, which was easy actually for the Bolsheviks then to undermine. And nobody took the Bolsheviks seriously because they were so tiny. I mean, Trotsky joked that, you know, you could fit the whole lot of them into two charabancs, you know, and then suddenly they found that there was this huge surge because Lenin very cleverly created basically the Soviet Union on the basis of three great lies. One being the idea that he was going to give peace to the soldiers, when in fact he wanted to turn the war against Germany, the imperialist war, into an international civil war. The workers in the factories, of course, were not going to be allowed to really run the factories. It will be the party and the state. And of course, the peasants were not going to be allowed to own the land, and they'd been promised land and liberty. So those three lies meant that they actually got a surge of support during that particular autumn, late summer, early autumn of 1917.
Certainly, as you read the book, Lenin particularly comes through as extraordinarily ruthless.
Absolutely ruthless, but brilliant. I mean, you know, a terrifying combination of the two.
And again, reading the book, there's a lot happening in Central Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Poland,
yes,
Finland, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And before I returned to Florence about 4.5 years ago, lived for 3 years in Warsaw and was working in that part of the world. So I'm very aware of the memory of the relationship with Russia. But with the miracle of Volga, for a while, it was established that there should be a Polish state, and that,
yes,
you know, Russia's boundaries were quite a lot further east. But do you feel that was very much unfinished business?
Oh, well, of course, when one thinks of the sort of the different partitions of Poland in the past and all the rest of it. There were also huge numbers of Poles in Russia itself, and particularly in Siberia, who'd been sent there by the Tsarist regime as prisoners and so forth. And actually during, and I'm describing it in the book, I mean, during the Civil War, you get a Polish legion forming in Siberia, and you have the Czechs as well, who played an absolutely crucial role, because without the Czech legion in Siberia, you wouldn't really have had a civil war in the whole of the eastern areas at all.
And I think it's Norman Davis who wrote a book which describes both the wars as essentially being one war, which never had a pause, but just first half, second half, continued all the way through. Do you subscribe to that view?
Not entirely. I mean, Norman is plus polonais que les polonais, as I think is fairly well known. But I mean, there's an element of truth in there. But I think that he does. I think he plays that one a little bit too far. But anyway,
I'm just interested as to whether you think that there was almost an inevitability that the Russian Revolution would continue to expand westwards.
Well, that's what they thought, but you know, I think every historian is forced to subscribe to the idea that nothing is inevitable in history, and it was certainly true that the idea of Lenin and the others that, you know, you would have worldwide revolution once you got to Germany. And this, of course, is, as you rightly have linked it to, of course, is to their invasion of Poland and the Battle of 1920, and why the Poles, of course, are so proud about, not surprisingly, about their great decisive victory on the Vistula, the miracle of the Vistula.
Celebrated very
well, absolutely.
So I'm just going to give the audience an opportunity. Are there people in the room who've read some or all of the Russian Revolution book? One or two, very good. And because this is your opportunity to, you know, the Ultimate Book Club, to ask Antony anything, comment, question, whatever, about your experience of reading the book. So we'll do that before we move on, if you would like to. No, do I? No takers for that. Oh yeah, we've got one. Okay, let me bring you the microphone, because then the people on the Zoom, as well as the people in the room, can hear what's going on.
Hello, it's Antony. I'm Christina Dykes. I'm visitor to Florence just this week, but we've come to listen to to you tonight because I am reading the book. And actually, it's a comment. I want to congratulate you on the ability that you have to weave the many threads of the story of the Russian Revolution together. And as a very immature writer, I was just wondering your ability to do that. How was it? How was it developed? Because there are so many threads that you've managed to bring together.
It's rather hard looking back, thinking how does one do it? It's like trying to work out how you learn to swim in a way, I suppose. But I think with sort of basically it does come with experience. But the vital thing of all is, which many people I think, and certainly younger writers, and I had this problem myself, one underestimates the importance of the process of marshalling the material before you get onto the writing. And that is the joy. When I started, I mean, I'm certainly old enough, and probably only a few people here probably will remember the days of the non-electric typewriter and the card index system and things like that. I mean, the joy of the computer and of a PC particularly is the way that you can move material from one skeleton chapter to another and all the rest of it. And then you can see exactly how everything is developing before you start writing. And I think the great mistake that so many writers make is to start writing too early. And then they get trapped. I think the old Hemingway, Gabriel Garcia Marquez advice is saying, you know, slightly exaggerated, saying, you know, you should spend 3 months on the first paragraph and then the book will write itself. Again, a bit of an exaggeration, but actually there's a big element of truth behind it.
I think the comment was great because it is an unbelievably complex story, and you do make sense of it. I mean, by the end, you have a sense of what actually happened. It's quite an achievement.
Well, I hope so. Anyway, my editor of first resort, Artemis, is the one who goes through and writes alongside a paragraph, "Don't understand" or "boring." So.
You're very lucky to be married to a writer as eminent as Artemis Cooper. Harry.
Thank you, Simon. Anthony, actually, I was thrilled to be here. I've read most of your books, and I'm about 25% through on the your current one. I'm Jewish, and like most Jews in UK, in America, and so on, our forefathers left Poland, Lithuania, Russia.
Pale of settlement, yes.
The Pale of Settlement it was, which was actually dominated and influenced by what came out of St. Petersburg, the Tsars.
Exactly.
And therefore, and we left because of the brutality of the pogroms that happened at that time. And you think about Russia as a country, and I'm struggling not to make a generalization, but I'm not going to be successful in this because I am going to make a generalization. It would seem to me that even from the time of Ivan the Terrible, Catherine the Great, all of them, that there is a theme that goes through Russia, which you certainly portray in your book, which is of unbelievable brutality. In the wars, the meat grinder.
Yes.
You saw what happened in Budapest. You saw what happened in Prague in all of our lifetimes. And of course, now we're seeing exactly the same in Ukraine. And is that a national characteristic, this brutality, or am I just ridiculously generalizing?
No, there is no national DNA, as everybody will recognize. But at the same time, there are national myths, self-images, and so forth, which do perpetuate themselves. And I think what one's seen, and there's been quite an interesting debate with other historians and so forth about the origins of the brutality of the Russian way of war. Now, many will go back to the Mongol invasions of the 13th century and the idea that to achieve the sort of terror that you want, it meant a question of mass killing of civilians, mass rape, destruction, and all the rest of it. Why was that still perpetuated in Russia rather than in Europe? Well, one has to remember how horrific the wars of religion were in the 17th century in Europe. But there was one difference, and that was there was an enlightenment which followed, but also in the 19th century, there was much more of an emphasis on humanitarian ideals and so forth, which never happened really in Russia. And I found this very striking when thinking about having worked on the Red Army in the Second World War. It's not just that they're terrible to their opponents or to their victims. I mean, I was condemned, as I mentioned earlier, about the whole business about the mass rapes and so forth, whether German women, Russian, well, actually Russian and Ukrainian women too, who were taken by the Nazis for slave labor. They suffered from the Red Army as well. But the point was that the Russians will, or have been encouraged in many ways to treat their own people as badly. And this is a thing which one can only describe as sort of a knock-on theory of oppression. They've been humiliated themselves, particularly under Stalin, and so they took it out on the most vulnerable people who happened to be the women as they advanced. And I'm seeing this again in Ukraine. I mean, I remember being shocked in Russia in the early 90s with the number of suicides amongst the young recruits. Up to 5,000 a year were committing suicide. Fury, but not surprisingly, from Russian mothers. But I mean, you know, that was still regarded as a sort of almost a natural process of recruiting and toughening up the soldiers that they were using. And so we're seeing the same thing again in Ukraine, I'm afraid. And I don't think that much is going to change in that particular way.
Interesting phrase, the Russian way of doing war.
Yes.
Yeah. And this leads me into the question I warned you I was going to ask is this idea that history repeats itself. Where do you stand on that? Because lots of people are drawing parallels with the 1930s, is what's going on.
Well, there are certain mistakes. Let's face it, in the 1930s, we made the mistake, the British and the French made the mistake of believing that nobody would be stupid enough to want to have another world war after the First World War. But we therefore completely underestimated Hitler, and we made the same mistake again with Putin. But that's partly because we don't do dictator syndrome. We tend to look at the world very much more through the eyes of democratic confirmation bias. We cannot believe that actually a dictator thinks in a different way, even to a general, because quite often they will take on, as Putin did, you know, the idea of a huge risk when it was not absolutely necessary to do so. So one's got to be ready to see that things do not work out in the same way. So yes, there are certain, I think most historians now accept the sort of phrase that, you know, history can rhyme, history can have echoes, but it never repeats itself as such. And that's been actually one of the dangers, I think, in British and American politics, when people have made false comparisons with the past. The idea of political leaders wanting to sound Churchillian or Rooseveltian has always been a great temptation. And I'm afraid, you know, let's face it, the Second World War was a war like no other, and yet people make more comparisons to the Second World War than on any other, and particularly when a leader wants to emphasize the importance of a crisis or wants to sound grandiose in a way, they will make that sort of parallel. And that, I think, is very, very dangerous. And the media, of course, follow it through with gusto.
I mean, yes, a question from Jan.
Yes, thank you. I'd just like to follow through a bit on your assessment of Russian thinking and Putin, etc. In the last couple of days, Xi or Xi, how am I pronouncing that? The premier of China? Sorry, Xi. Anyway, signed a pact, came out in the New York Times and Washington Post with not quite the best of relations, but they certainly agreed between China and Russia to continue to share resources. A comment that I read that struck me was that China has now turned Russia into its natural resource player, which is very much a second condition, a second status, if you will, for Russia. How do you see Putin, who is extolling the world with how he's going to do this grand recreation of the Russian Empire, with the fact that he is signing away Russian resources to a power immensely more powerful than him,
Yes.
with a completely different governmental structure. And how is he going to reconcile that, in your opinion?
I think that Putin is now desperate to solve problems in the short term. I mean, the real thing is what he should be worried about is China's ambitions in the Far East. We saw and described in the Russian Civil War book the way that the Japanese in 1918, 1919, landed over 80,000 troops through Vladivostok, hoping to take over a large part of the maritime provinces of the Far East all around. And that, of course, had been Chinese territory. So I think we might well see that President Xi has got rather a large eye fixed on that particular area. But you're absolutely right about the resources. And the way that, whether it's above all energy resources as well as building and wood and timber and so forth, Russia is the ideal neighbor, and especially a neighbor who is going to be beholden to the Chinese. The real danger, I think, is in terms of geopolitics. We're into a new era. During the first Cold War, Cold War I, up until 1989 or 1988, whenever, one could rely pretty well on both the Russian and Chinese communist leaders more or less sticking to what they said or what they predicted or whatever. Now we're into a totally different era. And this really is rather worrying. How on earth could one have a resolution to war in Ukraine where you cannot for a moment trust Putin from one day to the next on what he will do or what he will say and then what he will do? So from that point of view, I think we are in a dangerous area, particularly for conventional diplomacy. And we'll have to see how things turn out in that particular way. Well, we don't really know exactly at what point Putin is actually going to receive weapons and, above all, ammunition, because that's what he's so desperately in need of at the moment from China. There's a certain amount of things going on. One hears certain intelligence reports on various deals that are being done. But at the moment, Xi wants to try and play both a double game in the sense of playing a honest broker, which of course is ridiculous, but at the same time wants to make sure that Putin is not defeated. I mean, for Xi, one thing which actually also would be very dangerous would be to have a complete Putin victory. So he's in actually a very complicated position, and we'll see how that one plays out. But I don't think that we're going to see a nuclear problem, because for Xi that would be catastrophic. I think that he would be, even though I think there's no chance of it, Xi, I think, would be very afraid that if Putin did set off a nuclear, even just a tactical nuclear or battlefield nuclear weapon to frighten the West, he cannot rule out, but actually I think he could rule out the possibility of Biden providing nuclear-tipped cruises to Taiwan. And that, of course, would terrify him. So from that point of view, I think there will be a certain pressure from Xi on Putin not to go too far. But at the same time, I think that he's going to be there in the background, and he does not want to see Putin completely humiliated.
And it presumably serves his longer strategy well if the war goes long.
Well, so much will depend. I mean, I'm afraid it's a little bit like playing sort of, three-dimensional chess or whatever, or a pinball game. You don't know how the ball is going to bounce off in different directions.
We've got some more questions. We'll go to Vin first and then John afterwards.
Oh, so it's an honor to interact with you. Just building on that point, so there are two sort of contrasting views on the current war in Ukraine. One is that it's probably a survival instinct because of what NATO has been trying to do with Ukraine and the US sanctions since the fall of USSR, and the other view being that it's more individualistic, as Putin probably sees himself more in the mold of Peter the Great rather than the Bolsheviks. So what is your stance on these two sort of contrasting theories? And if it is the latter, then do you believe that once that individual is out of the picture, it may change drastically?
I think it's very striking. Of course, there's no room to go into it in the book. The way that it's been emphasizing the way that Putin is sort of looking back to the Soviet Union. It's not actually. Putin is part of an ideological descent going from the whites who were defeated in the Russian Civil War. And you may remember the whole business about Dugin, who was the one whose daughter was blown up in that car, who was one of the, along with Medinsky and the others, who were part of the sort of ideological background to Putin. And they're the ones who believe that the West is fundamentally corrupt and is collapsing, and that that the Slavic Holy Russia Orthodox nation has the right to dominate the whole of the Eurasian landmass from Vladivostok to Dublin, or they did actually also mention Lisbon. Which gives you an idea. And the only parallel there, in fact, actually, of course, is really with Hitler and the belief that you can take over any adjoining country and impose your own particular regime. But I mean, Putin has been bringing back the bodies of white generals from the Russian Civil War, setting up monuments to the horror of old Soviet loyalists. So from that point of view, things are rather different. I think that people quite often sort of will try and have made mistakes in sort of analyzing what Putin's view of the world is in this particular way. But there's no doubt about it. It is the restitution in a way of the Russian Empire, not of the Soviet Union, even though the two do very much overlap. Yes.
Before we go to John, I'm just going to ask Sarah if she can put up the chat box so I can see it on the screen, so that the people on the Zoom, if you want to get involved, you can post something in the chat and I'll read it out on your behalf. But now, John.
Right.
Thank you very much for everything that you've said so far. Very interesting. I'd be very interested in your views on two arguments that are very popular in Italy. One of them says, well, we probably brought this on ourselves by not properly ruling out Ukrainian membership of NATO. And the second says, well, the east of Ukraine, they were mostly Russian speaking. It was once part of a greater Russia. In the end, he's going to end up getting that. And that's probably a good thing, because then he'll be happy and he will not cause any more problems.
Well, on the second one, the argument can go both ways. It's quite interesting because, of course, Putin tried to argue that all Russian culture came from Kiev, but then the Ukrainian answer to that could be right. Well, Russia then belongs to Ukraine rather than the other way around. So I think one can not take that one over seriously. There's always been this sort of Russian idea that Ukraine is little Russia, great Russia, little Russia, white Russia. And for Putin, of course, the loss of Ukraine, the loss of Belarus in the 90s was absolutely sort of disastrous. These were the key pieces really in the jigsaw. And that's why he's so determined to get them back. He's also determined to get Kazakhstan back, and sometimes through the most ludicrous movies and things like that, but there isn't time to go into that. But there is this, as I say, this sort of, this desperation to reconstitute the past. Hang on, what was the first part of the question? It was about, about NATO, indeed. Well, I think on the whole, and he is a very remarkable man indeed, I think Jens Stoltenberg has done a superb job in getting the NATO alliance together, in not going too far, basically taking things step by step, I mean, many people have been very frustrated, particularly with Germany and so forth, and Scholz, that things have gone so slowly. But at the same time, they've not really made the dangerous moves that they might have made, which would have given Putin sort of an excuse to overreact. So from that point of view, it's sort of very difficult to see how things will turn out. And the trouble is, everyone is sort of saying, how's it going to end? Well, I mean, one can come up with a pretty good menu of possibilities. None of them are very attractive in a number of ways. In Helsinki, not long ago, I said, you know, there is always the possibility if the Russian army does collapse, which is a distinct possibility, will that lead to the disintegration of the Russian Federation? Because that actually would produce the most appalling humanitarian disaster. I mean, we surely learned by now that there is nothing worse than interfering in another country's civil war. But I mean, to interfere in Russia, as Bismarck rightly said, don't invade Russia. And of course, he was quite right. We wouldn't be able to do that. Anyway, I mentioned that, but afterwards I got attacked by 2 Ukrainian women saying, how could I show any humanity towards Russia after what they've done to Ukraine and all the rest of it? But I still think that it would be a humanitarian disaster, which would be absolutely terrifying.
Kim.
Thank you very much. I, in my youth, was a Soviet specialist, and I was a student of Leonard Shapiro at the London School of Economics many years ago, and your comments are very interesting. And what strikes me with someone, when you go back to the pre-Soviet history, as you have done, that this question of what lessons can we learn from history is a slightly different cast, because many of us are kind of fixated on the Soviet period. And what you're suggesting is that in some ways, the Soviet Union was the aberration. And that Putin sees it as the aberration, so that he is nostalgic for the power it represented, but not for its views. And from my own time there and watching what's happening, I'm surprised at the rehabilitation of religion and the church, etc. in Russia. You wouldn't have seen that coming if you were immersed in the Soviet Union. What do you think the broader application or the broader resonance of Putin's kind of white Russian view of history, of the history of that part of the world, has with a broader public, most of which has been educated and formed by Soviet era institutions? Do you see that this is something that has traction and resonance, or is it really because he has such ultimate power that he can impose that view on his own policies?
I think most, certainly from what I'm hearing from Russian friends and so forth, is that most prefer not to think about it at all. As far as they're concerned, their lives have not been changed in a dramatic way, really, by the war, and they prefer to ignore as much as they possibly can. I think a lot are deeply uneasy. I mean, one keeps on getting different figures, you know, from the different Levada polls and so forth. You know, as it dropped from 70% down to 25%, as some people seem to argue. I don't think it's been that dramatic. Sorry, in terms of support for Putin and the war. But there's no doubt about it. Most people prefer not to think about it. They prefer to just get on with their lives as far as they can. Now, I don't think they're going to be able to do that for very much longer, and certainly by next year, things are going to be very, very tough in Russia. There's no doubt about that. But when one thinks of all of those who've left for the Caucasus, who've left for Finland and got out of the country and all the rest of it, I mean, these are the people they need for the future. The high tech, the real sort of experts who could modernize Russian society. But the vast majority of them have got out. So from that point of view, one's got either those who rely on their analog televisions and therefore can only see Kremlin propaganda, and that is almost 70% of the population anyway. So it's very, very difficult to know sort of exactly where the overlap comes between those who really do oppose the war, because, you know, you cannot blame them for, apart from sort of like the suicidal bravery of Navalny and others, you can't really expect them, to keep on going out and be beaten up by the riot police. So it's I think quite hard for outsiders, particularly, to be able to assess exactly the level of support for the war.
Thank you. One of the explanations for the war in Ukraine that resonates with me is the idea that the Russian population is collapsing and Putin is scared to death of the numbers. And it sort of reminds me of one of the reasons we got World War I, because the Austrians and the Germans were scared to death of the increase in Russian population compared with theirs. At any rate, this takes the discussion out of the realm of ideology and puts it in the realm of Russian national interest, which appeals to me as an approach. I wondered what you thought about that.
Well, it's a total paradox. I mean, when you're worried about your population decline, why start a war? I mean, it's totally contradictory. But what we're seeing, of course, is that Putin's idea is that by taking over Ukraine, they by definition become Russian, and therefore the population rises again. But I mean, I think that shows, rather a lot of his own mixed-up thinking in this particular way.
I just wanted to ask one question, and soon we'll move on to other subjects. But as a student of military affairs and how wars work, how they're done, I quite like your assessment of what looks like the huge miscalculation that was made at the beginning, and where they've got to now, and how on earth, from the Russian perspective, they can take this thing forward to any kind of demonstrable success.
Well, right from the start, we see Putin in a curious way obsessed with some of the symbols of the Second World War, whether it was a question of, the tanks rolling into Berlin under Marshal Zhukov, and they made exactly the same mistakes. They even started strapping iron bedsteads to the outside of their tanks, both in 1945 and last year, thinking that that would act as a form of sort of reactive armor. In fact, actually, it helped the Ukrainian tank hunting groups spot them much more rapidly. He's made so many other mistakes in this particular way, and there was no infantry support to the tanks coming in. They have also made vast mistakes in terms of their rearmament policy ever since 2014, and throwing money, in fact, even earlier than that, but I mean, throwing money at the problem, with their famous T-14 Armata tank, which is supposed to be the most sophisticated tank in the world, but all it's good for is trundling across Red Square on the 9th of May every year on the victory parades. So they're not achieving what they set out to do in any way possible. So whether they can actually concentrate enough men to the meat grinder to counter the improvement, in Ukrainian professionalism, but also for the weapons coming from the West, coming from other NATO countries, I think is rather doubtful. I don't think that the numbers, the old idea of the Russian steamroller from just before the First World War, is actually going to be relevant anymore. So from that point of view, even though they may increase from 500,000 with call-ups and all the rest of it, I mean, these guys have been sent into battle, having been told that they should borrowed or get the sanitary pads from their mothers and girlfriends or whatever, because they weren't going to get any bandages. Well, I mean, if you're not going to equip your soldiers, what effect is that going to have on their morale? And this is exactly what happened with the Red Army in the Second World War. The demoralization when they were told to go out into no man's land and strip the clothes or the uniforms off their dead comrades so that they could be recycled amongst new soldiers coming in, had a devastating effect on morale. So I don't think that we're going to see, shall we say, a revival in Russian morale in that particular way.
One here. Following up
on that point. What is the relationship between Putin and his little cabal and the army and all the military forces? And don't the military get enough sometime and rebel?
Well, one of the problems, of course, is that Putin believes in divide and rule, and that is why you get this sort of internal tension between FSB, GRU, all the different organizations, the National Guard. Putin has set all these up so that there cannot really be a Paris coup. But at the same time, then let's have any illusions. If Putin is replaced, the old Soviet system was to send off the leader to the sanatorium while they decided who was going to take over. We may see Putin suddenly disappear into a sanatorium at one point. I've no idea. But at the same time, the idea that Prigozhin or Patrushev should take over shouldn't fill us with hope, because I mean the two are appalling thugs. I mean, Prigozhin, the worst of the lot. So you've got Wagner as well, hating the army, and of course the army will never forgive him. So this is one of the reasons why I think he may have protected his own position against a Paris coup, but at the same time, there is no line of succession. I mean, even in Soviet days, there was always a fairly clear line of succession. That doesn't exist, and that is actually one of the dangers in how you actually end this war.
Hold on to nurse for fear of worse. I mean, it's a really scary concept when nurse is Putin. There's one coming from the Zoom from Edward Cheney. Don't you think the current crisis could have been avoided if the West had recognized the annexation of Crimea? Gorbachev approved, after all, as did most Crimeans. I can't help wondering whether Putin would have invaded Ukraine if Trumpy had been re-elected. And your account of earlier Russian history surely reminds one of the extent to which an ungrateful West, and especially America, has refused to recognize that post-Cold War Russia has never been so civilized. Was the expansion of NATO and the EU really necessary, given we promised Gorbachev and Yeltsin that we wouldn't?
Well, shall we say there are a number of issues there. But anyway, it is true that there were particular moments, especially around the time of the invasion of Georgia and so forth, when I think that both EU and NATO should have been much more cautious. But at the same time, why should not sovereign states, particularly on the front line, who had a very bad experience of Russian occupation and conquest in the past, not have the right to actually join voluntarily? It wasn't as if they were forced into NATO or the EU, they applied to join. So, should we therefore admit that sort of a great power has the right to veto the democratic and the sovereign right of nations to make their own particular decisions? But, to try to counterbalance that, for what has happened in Ukraine and to justify the atrocities committed in Ukraine by Putin's forces, I think is totally out of balance, and I wouldn't for a moment recognize that.
Unless there's any absolutely bursting other questions or comments, I want to move on to the final part of the discussion, which is bringing it all back home and looking back a bit into Florence and Tuscany. Because as many of you will know, Antony's grandmother was an extraordinary woman called Lena Waterfield. And Lena was a leading member of the English colony at Florence, I think Room with the View and all that, and was one of the founding committee of the British Institute of Florence 105 years ago. So thank you, Lena. We have her papers in our archive. And so I really just wanted to give you the chance to just talk a little bit about your own memories of your grandmother and your reflections from a personal perspective on that story and the contribution she made to Florence and the Institute and all the rest of it.
Well, this was sort of late 1916, early 1917, when Italy was under a lot of pressure and in a way was being forced somehow to take decisions on which side to support in the First World War. this was when they decided that they felt that, you know, the non-central powers argument should be got across, and that was the whole idea of behind the British Institute. And so Lena went down to see Rennell and Rod, the ambassador, who actually was the father-in-law of Nancy Mitford, the father of Rod, Peter Rod. And he immediately said, right, we'll go back to London and see John Buchan, later Lord Breakspear, who was really in charge of British sort of propaganda at that particular time. And so really that was how it sort of got going, and with the other members of the committee and so forth, and lots of Italian friends and Florentine friends. That was in many ways, you know, the start of the library and then of the British Institute itself, which was unique in its early days, in its sort of quasi-governmental sort of existence, which didn't last very long, but it was quite something at the time. But then she had a curious career in many ways, because she was already a writer. Her great friend, whom she also wrote, was John Addington Symonds' daughter, Madge Symonds, who was my mother's godmother. And they did sort of various books together, and she did books on Italy and different areas. But also her great aunt, the notorious Janet Ross, who was always regarded as formidable. I think was the adjective always. It's always said that actually there was one person who'd had a letter of introduction who turned up and rang the bell at Poggio Verano, and then suddenly had a panic attack and ran off before the place was answered. Because there were a number of myths. I mean, of course, the favorite myth was that Ouida, who was the great popular novelist of the time, had hated Janet Ross because she was convinced that Janet Ross had somehow seduced the Marchese La Stufa, who owned, I've forgotten the name of the place where they were living. But actually, Janet Ross actually was lesbian. She didn't, I don't think there was any question of her actually seducing the La Stufa. But anyway, Rita was absolutely convinced about this, and so she wrote this devastating novel where this character, Lady Joan or whatever, is an absolute blackguard, or whatever the female equivalent is of a sort of blackguard. And it was always said that Aunt Janet had a copy of the book, shorn of its bindings, ready in the lavatory for people to use. Whether that was true or not, I have no idea. But anyway, and then the story went on to say that actually she'd appeared in the Via Tornabuoni with a horsewhip ready to whip Rita. So, you could imagine. I mean, people had a wonderful gossip at the time, but I didn't think any of it was very true.
And your own mother was raised substantially in Tuscany, not so much.
Yes, I mean either in Taula, which is at the northern end of the Garpagnana, which my grandfather fell in love with when he was at Oxford. He walked from Portofino all the way over the hills funny enough, with a cousin of my grandmother's, who he hadn't even met at the time. And he saw the castle at Taula, or the Fortezza, where the Spaniards had put earth on the 2/3 or 3/4 of the roof to absorb the recoil of the cannons. And there was a peasant growing corn up there. And so when he eventually did buy it, he realized that this was the one possibility of creating this fabulous garden in the sky. And I mean, you know, as a child, there was an avenue of mature ilex, and we would tie our hammocks between the ilex and sleep up there at night. I mean, it really was rather magical.
Did you visit frequently as a child?
Oh yes, we were every summer. I mean, we were out there every summer. My grandmother was still living there. And then things became impossible because she fainted when she got up to the top of a flight of stone stairs. Sorry, I'm getting it too close. She fainted and fell backwards and broke her back. And so really she was sort of more or less incapacitated for the rest of her life. And that's when she came back to England, because it was impossible to expect everybody to look after her on her own out at Taula.
She was a journalist, you know. She worked, I think, for the Observer.
Well, she did, and I mean, ironically, one thinks of the Observer sort of, you know, left of centre and all the rest of it. But Gowlin was who was the editor, was a great admirer of Mussolini. And eventually he's sacked by grandmother because of, irreconcilable differences. Meanwhile, my grandfather, although he was a painter, was also acting, I suppose, I want to describe it almost as a stringer for the Manchester Guardian. So, but they did get out in time in 1940 when the black shirts arrived up at Poggioverado to arrest them. They'd just managed to get on one of the last trains going over the frontier. But then they arrived in Aix-les-Bains just as the German motorbikes were coming into town.
Has anyone got the film rights to all this?
Well, I think I should have them, but nobody's approached me on that.
We can talk about that after. But I hope that the then director of the British Institute wasn't in cahoots with the editor of the Observer to shaft your grandmother, because the then director was a chap called Harold Goad, who was a full-blown fascist sympathizer.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
In support of
No. I think she'd been sacked beforehand, but I don't know whether it's true or not. But my grandmother did sort of claim that she did have to brush off Mussolini's hands. There was, shall we say, a touch of the Berlusconi even in those days. I don't know whether that was. But when I remember my grandmother and a large sort of figure, I didn't quite sort of. I wasn't enjoying it. Well, Derek Hill did a portrait of her, which actually I think is in the Liverpool. This was in the early 50s, by which time she'd already broken her back and all that, and so put on a huge amount of weight. And she said, "Oh, Derek, can't you reduce sort of the bulk a little bit?" And he said, "Oh no, Lena, that would spoil the triangle."
See, thanks for that. But there's an extant portrait of her as a young woman where she's extremely gracious.
Oh yes, well that was by Watts. But actually, Watts did adult portraits of 4 generations of the family, which is rather extraordinary, I think, for any painter in that particular way.
Do you have any continuing links with Florence and Tuscany yourself?
Well, sadly not. No, I mean, because Arula eventually had to be sold, and then shall we say the Belliate got their hands on it, but then let's go there. Of course, the Poggioverado, the trouble was that it was used as a prisoner of war camp right at the end, so that wrecked the farms, and eventually. It was, of course, it was so, but I think that was because my grandmother was so demoralized. They'd been suffered double death duties because my uncle, who it was left to by Aunt Janet, was killed in the war. And so there were double death duties. And of course, there simply wasn't the money there to rebuild the farms after the wreckage at the end.
Well, we love these kinds of stories because the thing that I personally love about the British Institute of Florence is it was still doing what we always did, which is but the through line from the Grand Tour and the English colony and the special friendship between the Inglesi, which includes all the other non-Italian people, and the Florentines, and here we still are doing it today. So it's just nice to have those stories.
Those links, absolutely. Well, the Anglo-Becero, yes.
Absolutely. Okay, I think we're getting towards a natural conclusion, but I'm certainly ready to have any more questions or comments that people would like to make. There's one up on the screen, which Penny's just pointed out, which goes back to Ukraine, and I quail a bit because compared to previous historical events preceding the First and Second World War, how close to Third World War do you think we are? Do you want to take that one briefly?
No, I don't think we're going to see a Third World War. I think that people will pull back, but the future is terrifyingly unpredictable, particularly when one starts to see the split between the authoritarian nations and the democratic nations, because we are now getting into the era of unmanned weapon systems. And if you are ruthless enough and you are prepared to allow machines to take killing decisions without any human intervention, then I think we are in a very, very scary place.
Generally scary situation with AI.
It is, absolutely, absolutely.
Well, that's a whole other subject, so let's not get that now.
Then that's
I want to try and end on, okay, we've got one, I'll let one more. Yeah.
About a year ago, I decided that I didn't know enough. I didn't really understand why Germany had descended the way it did. So I decided to inform myself and started reading a lot of books. I think I'm up to 30 now. I started with Keynes, the economic consequences of the peace. I thought that was a natural point to start. But then about a month ago, on a podcast, I heard, who was on the podcast? The rest is history. Yeah, very good. But they argued that the origin of Nazism really goes back to the late 1800s, because, and they say, you know, by 1890, Darwinism was dominating everybody's way of interpreting the world, and the world really was a struggle to be the survivor.
Yes.
And that this was, so you do you agree with this?
Well, yes. I mean, for example, there was quite a debate over Daniel, what was his name, who did Hitler's Willing Executioners. What? Goldhagen, sorry, absolutely, Goldhagen's book. Now, Goldhagen tried to argue that the Germans were by definition and by nature, almost by DNA, anti-Semitic. But that's absolute rubbish, because actually under Frederick the Great, Germany was the least anti-Semitic country in Europe. It came in much later, during that particular period of the late 19th century, with this idea of, well, not so much Darwinism, but very much more of Spencer and others, who came up with all of these ideas of blood, natural selection, and so forth. And let's face it, even Churchill at one particular point believed in what? Eugenics, sorry, yes. So I mean, this was a period really where you know, there was a sort of a modern idea of the future. Now, a lot of this then led into sort of a lot of the anti-Semitic ideas. Whether Austria and Russia, you know, were actually major influences on a lot of the Germans who started to believe in this whole idea of partly the Van der Vogel and all the rest of it, of sort of healthy life and get rid of sort of contaminated blood, which isn't German, and all the rest of it. So the idea that it sort of goes all the way back is completely wrong and very, very misleading, I think.
I think we're probably going to have to draw to a conclusion that Antony's going to be around, so your other things you want to talk to, you can see if you can grab his attention.
I think I've done quite enough.
I think you probably have. But actually, what he's really going to do is sign books. So if you want to buy one of Antony's books, Paperback Exchange, thank you very much. They're with us tonight. And there's a selection of his books there, which you can buy. And Antony will sit at this table here,
right,
and sign them.
I always do what I'm told.
Yes. Oh, you did agree beforehand. And you asked for a table, I got you one. I just want to end on one small observation, which is Antony quite rightly points out that right at the very beginning, the John Buchan, who was famous as a novelist, 39 Steps and all that, and Minister of Propaganda, was involved in the idea of creating an institute to influence the Italians to join the right side. It didn't last very long, because the guy at the back there, the bronze bust, this distinguished chap with a beard, is Sir Walter Becker, who in 1920, when we were 3 years old, saved us from extinction through bankruptcy by giving us an interest-free loan. And they said the British government wasn't then and never is now even remotely generous. So we have Walter Becker at the back, just to remind us that without our friends and supporters, it's difficult to keep this place going. But anyhow, Antony, thank you, friend, supporter, very much for giving us your time too. Yeah. And thanks all to the Zoomers for joining us, and I hope that was interesting and you could hear us well. As is our custom, the people in the room, sadly not those on the Zoom, will now retire to the next door room where there's some delicious Frescobaldi wine, our current partners, waiting for you. And if you want to buy the books, you're here. If you want to get Antony to sign, he'll be here for a short while. Thank you very much, and see you all again soon. Bye for now.